Eminent Soviet engineer, a founder of the Soviet microelectronics industry. He was a good friend of convicted spies Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, suspected of being part of their espionage ring, hunted by the FBI for 40 years, but never found. Now, he's back, reclaiming his original name and the country he abandoned. Meet Joel Barr from Brooklyn, an American citizen once again.
This is an ABC News Nightline special investigation. American patriot, Soviet spy. Now reporting from Washington, Ted Koppel.
You're about to meet one of the Soviet Union's top engineers, a man with the vowels and rhythms of Brooklyn so deeply etched in his speech that you can even hear them when he speaks Russian. A man who's been on the run from the FBI for most of the past 40 years, but who now draws Social Security. Now, there's a question for you. Could a Soviet agent be eligible for Social Security? We need a little background here. Indeed, we need to go back to the very beginnings of the Cold War, when being pro-communist, which was not such a terrible thing during the U.S.-Soviet alliance of World War II, when that was no longer acceptable. So when the Soviets got the bomb and an American couple, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, was accused of helping them get it, well, the Rosenbergs were arrested in 1950, tried in 1951, and executed in the electric chair in June of 1953, on their wedding anniversary, as fate would have it.
He recruited a minimum of 18 of his classmates as Russian spies. There's no way you could describe the hideous nature of this group of people and what they did to this government, what it cost us.
Which brings us to Joel Barr. He was a member of the American Communist Party, recruited by Julius Rosenberg when they were classmates at City College in New York. In fact, they were in the same party unit, the same cell, together with this man, Alfred Sarant. More about him a little later. All three of them were very talented engineers who in 1940 worked as civilian employees of the U.S. Army Signal Corps. When the U.S. got into the war, they all went to work in defense-related industries. Barr and Sarant shared an apartment in New York while they worked on classified projects. In 1948, the FBI managed to break a Soviet code that enabled them to read intercepted Soviet cables. One of those cables, dating back to 1944, included the description of a Soviet agent. The FBI concluded that the description fit Joel Barr.
Our investigation identified Joel Barr as an American-born spy who stole, and from his various jobs, things that were passed on to the Russians.
That may have been what the FBI concluded, but Joel Barr adamantly denies it, and the FBI has never proved it. Never got a chance to, actually, because in 1948, just before the FBI began its investigation of him, Joel Barr left the country.
I even remember telling the Rosenbergs that this is a good time for us to leave because I sort of felt that things were going to get worse. And, but nobody wanted to come with me. They said, our job is here. We have to fight for communism in the United States.
Over the next 2 years, as communism expanded, things did get worse for American left-wingers. China fell to the communists. In June of 1950, war broke out in Korea. And with U.S. troops in combat against communist forces, sympathy for the American left reached an all-time low in this country.
They used the freedom granted them by American democracy to attack and belittle free American institutions.
It was against that backdrop that the Rosenbergs went on trial.
David Greenglass, Mrs. Rosenberg's brother, confessed theft of the secrets while stationed at the Los Alamos atomic project. He later became the government's chief witness in the process.
Greenglass not only turned in his sister and her husband, he also fingered Joel Barr as being part of the spy ring.
According to what Julius Rosenberg told David Greenglass, who in turn told us, Barr had been an important part of the network, had come under suspicion somehow, and had gotten out of the United States and gone to Europe, and was operating in Europe.
Just about the time that the FBI announced the arrest of David Greenglass, Joel Barr, who was then living in Paris, vanished. Al Sarant, Joel Barr's close friend who had worked with him at the Army Signal Corps, became the target of a growing investigation. He, too, after all, was a member of the party and had shared an apartment with Barr in New York. The FBI began interviewing Sarant at his home in Ithaca, New York.
Then they came back the next evening and the next evening and on and on and on, asking the same questions. He was not under arrest. They were just coming all the time. We decided that he should leave.
Carol Dorothy and Al Sarant were neighbors. Each was married. Each had children. They were also lovers.
And we took the exit and lit out for Tucson. We drove day and night. First one drove and then the other.
We lost the surveillance. He was in a car. One car was following another car. We lost him at a traffic light.
And then we went on to Mexico City from there.
And he decided with this lovely next-door neighbor, they would see the world rather than face the electric chair. This is wartime espionage.
In Mexico, the Soviet embassy was being watched by the FBI. So the two fugitives approached the Polish embassy.
We were pretty tense. We were pretty careful to see that nobody followed us. For a long time I was thinking I was going to get him off and go home. I had two children there, you see, as he did too. And of course we missed our children terribly.
You didn't think you were going away forever?
No, I didn't.
An agent from the Polish embassy took the two of them down to the Mexican border with Guatemala.
We crossed the river at night. We had to wait about 3 days until the moon was right and the river was right.
From Guatemala, they eventually made their way to Europe. And then they too disappeared.
This ABC News Nightline special investigation is brought to you by Ford.
Ford Trucks, the best never rest.
He left Paris in 1950, just as Ethel Rosenberg's brother was arrested by the FBI. He went to Prague. Why? He wanted to see Czechoslovakia.
Because of the socialist system there. I wanted to see socialism at work.
The FBI drew its own conclusions.
There was absolutely no question that Joel Barr was an American-born Russian agent who unfortunately was not here at the time, or you probably would have ended up being prosecuted with the Rosenbergs.
They wouldn't have executed me. That's clear. Because I didn't do anything. And I believe in the American judicial system sufficiently, even in that hysterical period.
But what made Joel Barr literally misty-eyed was being surrounded, for the first time in his life, by the slogans of the socialist world.
We are building a new society. Everything for people, for humanity, for democracy. For me, it was a dream come true. Well, I want to tell you that I cried. I really broke down. I'm sort of emotional, as you say. And I was so impressed by it that I really broke down.
But in Prague, there were also some unemotional, cold-eyed realists who recognized that in Joel Barr, they had an international fugitive on their hands.
When the Rosenberg were arrested, they came to me and said, look, and I read about it, and they said that obviously there's going to be trouble, and that's why I changed my name. They said you have to change your name, your family, and everybody would be involved.
Joel Barr ceased to exist. He was given a new name and what intelligence agencies call a legend. He would now be a South African. Someone in Czech or Soviet intelligence even injected a note of humor. His name henceforth would be Joseph Berg. Joe Berg. Joburg, as in the abbreviation for Johannesburg. The American who just slipped into Prague to sneak a peek at socialism was, without any apparent effort or problem, assimilated and absorbed behind the Iron Curtain. He was given a job in a nice apartment, and eventually he married a Czech woman, the daughter of a farmer. His family and friends back in the United States neither heard from him nor did they have any idea where he was. Then, one day, Berg was simply informed that he would be going to Moscow.
They called me in and said, look, Mr. Berg, you're going to Moscow. I said, for what purpose? Well, didn't tell me. And we flew to Moscow, took them to the hotel, and opened the door, and there was my friend Al with his wife. It was really a fantastic situation.
Remember Al Sarant and Carol Dorothy? They had made it to Moscow by way of Poland. Actually, they never did marry one another. There they were, the three of them, with their legends and their new names. Joel Barr was now Joe Berg. Carol Dorothy had become Anna Petrovna. Alfred Sarant had been given the identity of Philip Staros. Spies who'd come in from the cold, or dreamy ideologues who simply had gotten out of their depth. Either way, they were euphoric to be together again, and to be in the Soviet Union.
So we came here, and the overall feeling was that everything that we saw, we praised. And we just were, you know, so happy. We just felt that it was, you know, our dream, their dream has come true. So we've lived to see humanity on a new level of development.
He's still perfectly capable of talking that way, all these years later, without a trace of embarrassment, without any sense of contradiction. He'd never intended to leave the United States for good. He'd only wanted to take a look at Czechoslovakia to see socialism at work. He claims to have no real memory of why or how it was that first the Czechs and then the Soviets would welcome this wandering American into their midst without obstacles or even questions. The way had clearly been smoothed for Joel Barr and Al Sarant, perhaps because of what they had already done for the Soviet Union, but certainly because of what they were still capable of doing.
Then they told us we were going to go to Czechoslovakia, that it would be better for us there. Conditions are better there. We're still getting rid of the troubles of the war.
And so, shortly after Joel and Al and Carol were reunited in Moscow, the Soviets sent them back to Prague to work on scientific projects.
The jobs that we had in those days were related to defense, civil defense, or whatever you call it. It was anti-aircraft computer work.
These two American engineers, after all, were a godsend. They had worked on classified American defense projects, and they were quite prepared to share what they knew. Carol remembers that their Soviet handler, a man who called himself Robert, told them what was needed.
He said, one of the most frustrating things about the war was that when we shot at a plane, it had moved, and that we didn't know how to shoot so that we could hit the plane. And so they very seldom hit them. He said, if you could invent something that would hit the plane, that would be what we need.
And they did. These were two men, after all, who had worked on early radar projects back in the United States. And they succeeded in designing the first radar-controlled anti-aircraft gun system for the Soviet bloc.
A final appeal after 2 years of stays of execution was refused by President Eisenhower. The Rosenbergs, he said, betrayed the cause of freedom and have been accorded their full measure of justice.
Joel Barr remembers the day in 1953 that he picked up a Prague newspaper and learned that his old friends, the Rosenbergs, were dead.
I remember the time when I read about the execution of the Rosenberg. Well, imagine your best friend well, one of your best friends, let's put it that way, was executed in the electric chair. Well, that was pretty hard for me in those days, and I was terribly depressed, and this was one of those moments that I remember in my life, which was very, very difficult to get over.
Joel Barr and Al Sarant worked in Prague until 1955. And what they achieved must have been impressive, because when the two men, eager to expand their work, wrote to the Soviet government requesting permission to work there, permission was granted almost immediately. The two engineers set up shop in Leningrad. By now, the FBI was convinced that Barr, in particular, had been a member of the Rosenberg spy ring. Joel Barr operated as an espionage agent for the Russians and was connected with the Julius Rosenberg espionage ring. At this point, the question of whether Joel Barr had been a Soviet spy back in the United States became more or less academic. He and his fellow engineer, Al Sarant, were received and treated like major stars. They had large apartments. They were paid 10 times the wages of a Soviet citizen. Mark Kuchment, an emigre Soviet scientist, credits Barr and Sarant with having made an enormous contribution to Soviet science.
The design bureau, which was created by Al Sarant and Joel Barr, was a place where people believe Soviet microelectronics emerged. In fact, Al Sarant introduced the word microelectronics to the Soviet vocabulary.
Eric Ferdman worked in Sarant and Barr's institute for 20 years. He, of course, knew Joel Barr only as Joe Berg.
Berg was a very, I would say, brilliant engineer, one of the best I ever met in my life. But at the same time, you know, from the political viewpoint, he was just like a kid.
When they ran into troubles, when they had some big disagreements with their colleagues, one of the points of last resort, according to one of the colleagues of Al Sarant and Joel Barr, would be for them to call the KGB.
It was just my suspicion that they were Soviet spies, which have never been proven. I didn't understand how otherwise they could have such strong connections to KGB other than just working for KGB before.
We built the Maytag refrigerator with...
Again, a reminder, just a brief scene setter. Joel Barr, also known as Joe Berg, and Al Sarant, who was renamed Phil Staros, two Americans who may or may not have been Soviet agents back here in the United States, had been allowed, indeed encouraged, to set up a fairly significant microelectronics lab in Leningrad.
We were a closed organization because we were working on, obviously, our work could be used for defense, and I don't think it's any more a secret that we made first computers for defense work.
They were birds in a gilded cage, very well treated, but isolated. Carol Dorothy and Al Sarant, you'll recall, had fled the United States, leaving their families behind.
They told us once, you write a letter and we'll send it, but they didn't. We wrote a letter, but they didn't send it.
And with good reason. The FBI, after all, was still searching for traces of Sarant and Barr, still regularly questioning members of their families, still inspecting the family's mail. But no letters ever came from Al or Joe. If they had been political outcasts in the United States, then in the Soviet Union of the early 1960s, they were treated like national treasures. In 1962, Barr and Sarant received a visit at their Leningrad lab from Nikita Khrushchev himself.
And his neck, I've never seen a neck that large in my life, like a bull neck, you know?
Whatever support they had received previously could, under the patronage of Nikita Khrushchev, multiply.
When Khrushchev came to see us, We had, of course, we had organized. We knew a day in advance. This is like King Midas is coming to see you. What do you want?
This would prove to be the high watermark for Joel Barr and Al Sarant. With Khrushchev as their patron, they were granted permission and funding to set up a kind of Soviet Silicon Valley, an entire city they called Zeleningrad. Al Sarant and Joel Barr were its directors. They organized it along American lines. In fact, their longtime employee, Eric Ferdman, recalls that some of the information they got probably came from the United States through KGB channels.
In 1963, we got the document who was labeled as strictly confidential in Russia and strictly confidential in the United States at the same time. And that was the then very new IBM's project called New Processing Line, and that what later became IBM 360 family and then IBM 370 family. So we got that about 2 years before it was announced in the United States.
But that personal access to Soviet intelligence, the freedom to run their lab more or less as they saw fit, that lasted only until 1964, when Khrushchev was forced out of power.
We were so intimately connected with him that within a week after they got rid of him, they got rid of us.
They had met Khrushchev's successor, Leonid Brezhnev, while Khrushchev was still in power. But they didn't hit it off. Brezhnev didn't like foreigners.
When we met him the first time, he wasn't the president yet. And then this guy comes in, obviously Brezhnev, and he says, well, you probably know me. He doesn't say who it is. You probably know me. But it was said in such a way, with his diamond cufflinks and a diamond stick pin, that we got a very, very negative feeling about him. He says, you, as foreigners, not Americans, didn't say you Americans, you don't understand how our Soviet system works yet.
Under the Soviet system, Brezhnev style, Communist Party connections were more important than talent. Barr and Sarant had hired and fired according to merit, and they had hired a number of qualified Jews. That was not acceptable. The new Soviet Silicon Valley continued to be built, but others were put in charge. Barr and Sarant were demoted. They'd been too communist to succeed in the United States, not communist enough, though, in the present Soviet Union.
Minwax is proud to announce a new addition to the family.
So did Joel Barr and Al Sarant. Still, there was never any question of going back. Given the climate of the 60s, the United States couldn't have forgiven what Barr and Sarant had already done. And anyway, the Soviet Union wasn't about to let them go.
By the way, I was one of the chief propagandists for the Soviets, showing that the Americans, you know, I read the papers, we read constantly. Once a week we went to the library. We knew the economic situation in the States and so on. So we used all of these arguments to show that things were going badly there and they were getting better here.
As far as the FBI was concerned, Joel Barr had disappeared without a trace. And according to this 1964 memo, the Bureau had just about given up. All logical investigation to locate the subject has been completed, but nothing has been heard of his whereabouts since he has disappeared. Then, in August of 1968, Soviet tanks rolled into Czechoslovakia, and that country's brief flirtation with democracy, the so-called Prague Spring, was crushed. Alexander Dubček, the Czech leader who had tried to humanize the face of communism, was summoned to Moscow and brought to heel. But Joe Barr, whose wife was Czech, whose first home behind the Iron Curtain was in Czechoslovakia, was anything but disillusioned.
We were convinced that that whole affair was arranged by the Americans, that Dubček was a paid agent of the Americans. I was able to use my influence. My family was there in Czechoslovakia in 1968, in August or whatever it was. And I used my fact that my ability to use the minister's phone directly minister had a phone which had a direct line to Prague. And I would call up the Soviet embassy in Prague, and they helped my family fly out on an army plane from Prague to Leningrad.
Joe Barr, in other words, was still a man with influence in high Soviet places, a man whose confidence in the future of communism was unshaken.
We were the wave of the future, and with Eastern Europe and so on, if you drew a map showing the communist influence in the world, it was constantly increasing.
Joel Barr and Al Sarant continued their work in microelectronics and defense. Back in 1969, there was even a front-page article on their scientific achievements in the Leningrad edition of Pravda. But of course, their cover names were used, and no one in U.S. intelligence picked up the item, or any other clue. Barr and Sarant regularly lectured before Soviet military audiences. Carol Dorothy recalls that Al Sarant was especially popular with one of his clients.
The Navy just loved him. Well, he made the first computer for submarines.
In 1979, Al Sarant suffered a heart attack in Moscow, and there he died. But it was as Philip Staros, his cover in place to the very end, that he was ultimately buried in Leningrad.
We knew that we would get a refusal to put his real name down.
There weren't many people all that close to Joel Barr, and almost none now remained who knew his real identity.
Of course, people have died in my life, but a person as close as that, it's like, you know, almost you're dying yourself.
In all, Joel Barr has 6 children, 4 by his Czech wife and 2 others by a neighbor's wife, whom he describes somewhat quaintly as a close friend. Those 2 daughters, Julia, seen here dancing with her father, and Valeria, both share their father's love for music. Valeria, a sometime nightclub singer, is also, like her father, a computer specialist. Joel's son, Anton, is a full-time musician for the Czech opera. He acknowledges that it was often hard to explain to his friends how it was that his American-born father came to be working in the Soviet Union.
It was always difficult for me to explain to them how it happened. And really, I myself did not have a clear understanding of all the details. I would simply say that my father was a communist and decided to live in the Soviet Union.
Indeed, when the children were growing up, none of them knew that their father was an American. Even Joel's wife, Vera, didn't know until after she'd been married for 20 years.
I just had a feeling that he was not from Johannesburg, from South Africa. And then I was pleasantly surprised that it was America he came from.
Carol and Al Sarant also raised a family without acknowledging their own past.
You know, our children were very, you know, busy with their own lives, outgoing and not questioning. And then when they found out, they were all grown up before they found out who we really were. And they said, and you told us all those lies? And I said, no, don't say it that way. That's my legend.
My mother was definitely nothing to do with it. She just helped him to leave the country, that's all. She was a neighbor.
And your father?
And my father, I don't think that he was guilty.
Well, I'm sure that my mother was not involved in anything. And as for my father, I can't tell you for sure because I'm not him. But it might as well be that, you know, if they would take an innocent person and start questioning him for, you know, 8 hours non-stop, That would scare anyone. And just in those days, you didn't fool around with the FBI. So it might have been just that he was scared. On the other hand, I don't know for sure, sir.
As for Joel Barr, also known as Joe Berg, his home is still in Russia. He lives in Leningrad, which these days is once again known as St. Petersburg. Under the new climate that exists between Moscow and Washington, he's been back here a couple of times, even got his American passport reissued. And there's more. The rest of the story when we come back.
You must travel back.
As another indication of just how much things have changed in U.S.-Soviet relations over the past few years. Carol Dorothy, who had never formally renounced her U.S. citizenship, reapplied for a passport. She hadn't seen her children or family in nearly 40 years.
Of course, we would like to go home, but it was just impossible. I didn't really believe in it.
It took 18 months, but she got her U.S. passport back, and she received permission from Soviet authorities to leave for California. Two of Joel Barr's children, who had heard stories about America from their father while they were growing up, apparently liked what they heard. They defected and are now living in the United States. As for Joel Barr himself,
if I were running things in Washington, Joe Barr certainly would never be allowed back in the United States. Barr is a spy and a traitor. And I don't see any reason why we should allow a man who has devoted his life to the cause of the Soviet Union, including running a research laboratory for him, should ever be allowed back in the United States.
But Joel Barr, still working for that design bureau in what is once again St. Petersburg, has developed a complex new system for producing computer chips. The mini-fab, he calls it. And to put it bluntly, he's looking for investors back here. And he wanted his old name, his old identity, his old passport back, so that he could travel freely to the United States. He got it, too. That and more.
I'm an American. I have a passport to prove it. You want to see it? And, you know, the picture that I had when I left, that I was leaving a country that many good things in it, and a lot of bad things. And I came back and found out that I'm eligible to an apartment. You know, the Russians don't believe it, that I'm getting Social Security now.
Well, I'm not sure I believe it either. I mean, can you understand why I was laughing, Joe, when I said, why would you be eligible for Social Security? Why would you be eligible for Medicare? You spent the past 40 years in the Soviet Union.
It's your law. It's your government.
Is it your government?
And now it's my government. Now I can say it officially.
Is there something slightly miraculous in all of this to you?
Of course. I get down on my hands and knees every evening and praise the Lord.
Only a few weeks ago, Joel Barr made his second trip to the United States. We took him up to Columbia University, where he received his master's degree about 50 years ago. And there, at the foot of the steps leading up to Low Library, was a young man selling Trotskyite pamphlets. It was a moment of sublime irony.
Where did Lenin go wrong, for example? Because it's a fact. I mean, if you're going to say, no, you admit that Lenin went wrong, or maybe you don't.
Lenin died before the Stalinist system took hold. And
listen to me for just a second. I know you want to say something that's very important. That's going to change the world, probably, right? I mean, he just forgot that you can't keep people working without getting that feeling that they're getting something for it.
Your mistake is you're drawing a...
Supposing you are...
You spoke.
I think I
my
can talk
response.
to you. Think I can talk over him?
I love watching the two of you
asked
go
me
at
a
each other.
question.
That's the problem I have with you, Joe, is trying to get a word in.
He doesn't understand that I am a bigger communist than he is to this day. He doesn't believe me. Shall I show him my Communist Party card?
Communist Party card, Joe.
Well, you just still there. I'm a member of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. For... I never got out.
Excuse us, folks, if we could just get through here. Thank you. Nice talking to you.
Bye-bye. Meeting next week on Marxism in the modern world.
Does it amuse you at all, Joe, to hear yourself sometimes talking a little bit now at age 75 like a modified capitalist?
Well, if you had asked me 30 years ago if I would ever talk the way I do now, I would just laugh at you.
This is what Miracle Grow
answers to a few very old questions. And to a certain extent, he did. The FBI, or at least several people in the FBI, were convinced, are to this day convinced, that you were a spy. Do you deny that?
Of course I deny it.
Why?
I've showed that, because I wasn't a spy, that's all.
What's the difference between what you did and what the FBI regards as espionage, namely that you took information which you acquired while working for the defense industry in this country?
The definition of espionage, I think, is something different from that. I don't know the law, but I think that a person who emigrated to another country and worked for the government of that country, he was in a position where he either worked in his field or he, from political motives, or the motives that he analyzed in this way that you're talking about, that is, I'm spying now. You must understand and believe that the thought that I was spying for the Soviet Union against America never entered my mind.
You worked in the defense establishment, you left this country, you ended up going behind the Iron Curtain, you were given a new name, a new life, legend by the KGB, and you worked for 40 years of your life helping that system and that country. Now try and step out of yourself and look back and tell me how you think a person like that is seen. What do you think? I mean, we're living in different times today. You're not going to be prosecuted. You're not going to go to jail. But do you understand that this confusing persona, this charming Brooklyn-born guy who just goes trailing off in 100 different directions, not Machiavellian. Machiavellian was very smart. Yeah. Machiavelli was a man who was politically far more sophisticated than I think you will ever be. But if there's one name I wouldn't apply to you, it's Machiavelli. I don't think you're politically sophisticated at all. Politically, I think you're a dunce.
Well, maybe you're right. I voted for Brown.
You voted?
Of course I voted. Are you kidding? I'm a Democrat.
You're a piece of work. You really are. You voted?
Well, I have to do my duty.
What'd you get?
I have a number. I live in Brooklyn.
I'm asking you to be serious and for a moment as unevasive as you can be. When did you feel stuck, Joe? At which point did you say, huh, well, maybe I shouldn't have done this in the first place, but it's too late now?
The question is, I made this decision, and maybe it was not correct, because you're raising questions which never entered my mind, and you must admit that I would have probably should have hesitated and prepared myself so that the answers would be more to your liking and to the liking of the people who are going to be looking at this. But I'm trying to be as open as I can and as honest as I can. I'm trying to put it so that you, as a representative, in a way, of the public, will understand and maybe decide first that he really, well, you put it this way, that maybe the only, that's innocuous or naive, and actually maybe there's another approach to my thing. That is another answer. I'm not saying that I'm going to put these words in your mouth, but I think that there is another approach, because after all, the fact remains that I did what I did, lived through that period, don't feel, now that you started, I'm beginning to feel a little guilty now about the whole thing, that I, from that point of view, that is, that I used my knowledge to make anti-American weapons, if you put it that way, right? So what can I say? Well, it's probably true, but I think you have to consider the motives that are involved too. And I think that the motives were just as, maybe it was stupidity, all right. Person probably can be punished for being stupid.
This ABC News Nightline special investigation is brought to you by...
If I could turn the clock back for you to 1948, and you had a chance, knowing what you know now...
I'll answer you right away.
Go ahead.
I wouldn't have gone. Now, from what I know now, I would have stayed here. I think I wouldn't have become a reactionary. But certainly, I would say that the problems in my life would have been much less. And I think that I would have been not happier or happier. It doesn't matter. The point is that, as you know, I don't like to talk about such, how we say, fantasy. There's no point to it. What I'm interested in is tomorrow and my minifab.
Joel Barr makes your head throb. Charming, engaging, at times bewilderingly disingenuous. He still doesn't seem to fit into any easy preconception of what a spy should be. Of course, when you think about it for just a moment, that comes pretty close to a perfect definition of what a good spy should be able to do. You'll have to make up your own mind. That's our report for tonight. I'm Ted Koppel in Washington. For all of us here at ABC News, good night.
If you wish a videocassette version of Nightline, the cost is $14.98 plus $3.95 shipping and handling. If you wish a printed transcript, please send $4 to 1535 Grant Street, Denver, Colorado